Welcome to my book nook.
Welcome back to my book nook. We're in the middle of The Memory Keeper's Daughter. I hope you're enjoying it. Honestly, I had the hardest time putting this book down. I want to just keep reading, but I want to keep sharing too. So let's jump into it today. We're in June of 1970, and let's check in and see where they're at. Well, Phoebe certainly has your hair, Doro observed. Caroline touched the nape of her neck, considering. They were on the east side of Pittsburgh in an old factory building that had been converted into a progressive preschool. Light fell through the long windows and splashed in motes and patterns on the plank floor. It caught the auburn highlights in Phoebe's thin braids as she stood before a big wooden bin scooping lentils, letting them cascade into jars. At 6, she was chubby, with dimpled knees and a winning smile. Her eyes were a delicate almond shape, unsplanted, dark brown. Her hands were small, upslanted, dark brown. Her hands were small. This morning she wore a pink and white striped dress, which she had chosen and put on by herself backwards. She wore a pink sweater, too, which had caused a spectacular tantrum at home. She certainly got your temper. Leo, dead now for almost a year, had been fond of muttering this, and Caroline had always been astonished, not so much that he'd seen a genetic connection where none could exist, but that anyone would define her as a woman with a temper. "Do you think so?" she asked Doro, running her fingers through the hair behind her ear. "Do you think her hair's like mine?" "Oh, yes, sure it is." Phoebe was shoving her hands deep into the velvety lentils now, laughing with the little boy beside her. She lifted fistfuls and let them run through her fingers, and the boy held out a plastic yellow cup to catch them. To the other children in this preschool, Phoebe was simply herself, a friend who liked the color blue and popsicles and twirling in circles. Here, her differences went unnoticed. In the first weeks, Caroline had watched, warily braced against the sorts of comments she heard too often on playgrounds, at the grocery store, in the doctor's office. "What a terrible shame. Oh, you're living my worst nightmare. And once, at least she won't live very long. That's a blessing." Thoughtless or ignorant or cruel, it didn't matter. Over the years, these comments had rubbed a raw spot in Caroline's heart. But here the teachers were young and enthusiastic, and the parents had quietly followed their example. Phoebe might struggle more, go slower, but like any child, she'd learn. Lentils scattered on the floor, and the boy dropped his shovel and ran into the hall. Phoebe followed, braids flying, headed for the green room with its easels and its pots of paint. "This place has been so good for her," Doro said. Caroline nodded. "I wish the Board of Education could see her here." "You have a strong argument and a good lawyer. You'll be fine." Caroline glanced at her watch. Her friendship with Sandra had grown into a political force, and today the Upside Down Society, over 500 members strong, would ask the school board to include their children in public schools. Their chances were good, but Caroline was still very nervous. So much rested on this decision. A speeding child careened past Doro, who caught him gently by the shoulders. Doro's hair was pure white now, in striking contrast to her dark eyes, her smooth olive skin. She swam every morning, and she'd taken up golf, and lately Caroline often caught her smiling to herself, as if she had a secret. "It's so good of you to come today to cover for me," Caroline said, pulling on her coat. Doro waved her hand. "Don't mention it. I'd much rather be here, actually, than fighting with the department over my father's papers." Her voice was weary, but a smile flickered across her face. "Doro, if I didn't know better, I'd guess you were in love." Doro only laughed. "What a bold conjecture," she said. "And speaking of love, can I expect Al this afternoon? It's Friday, after all." The patterns of light and shadow in the sycamores weren't so soothing, like moving water. It was Friday, yes, but Caroline hadn't heard from Al all week. Usually it called from the road, from Columbus or Atlanta or even Chicago. He'd asked her to marry him twice this year, and each time her heart had flared with possibility, and each time she had said no. They had argued on his last visit. "You hold me at arm's length," he complained, and he left angry without saying goodbye. "We're just close friends, Al and I. It's not that easy." "Don't be ridiculous," Doro said. "Nothing simpler." So it was love, Caroline thought. She kissed Phoebe's soft cheek and went away in Leo's old Buick, black, vast, with a ride like a boat. In the last year of his life, Leo had grown frail, spending most of his days in an armchair near the window with a book in his lap, gazing out at the street. One day, Caroline had found him slumped, his gray hair sticking up at an awkward angle, his skin, even his lips, so pale. Dead. She knew this before she touched him. She took off his glasses, placed his fingertips on his eyelids, and drew them closed. Once they had taken his body away, she sat in his chair, trying to imagine what his life had been like. The tree branches moving silently outside the window, her own footsteps and Phoebe's making patterns on his ceiling. "Oh, Leo," she said out loud to the empty air, "I'm sorry you were so alone." At his funeral, a quiet affair crowded with physics professors and gardenias, Caroline offered to leave, but Doro wouldn't hear of it. "I'm used to you. I'm used to the company. No, you stay. We'll take it day by day." Caroline drove across the city she had come to love, this tough, gritty, strikingly beautiful city with its soaring buildings and ornate bridges and vast parks, its neighborhoods tucked into every emerald hill. She found a parking spot on the narrow street and entered the building, its stone darkened by decades of coal smoke. She walked through the foyer with its high ceilings and intricate mosaic floor and climbed 2 flights of stairs. The wooden door was darkly stained with a panel of cloudy glass and tarnished brass numbers 304B. She took a deep breath. She had not been this nervous since her oral exams, and she pushed the door open. The room's shabbiness surprised her. The big oak table was scratched, and the windows were cloudy, making the day outside seem muted and gray. Sandra was already sitting with 6 other parents from the upside-down board. Caroline felt a surge of affection. They had drifted into meetings one by one at first, people she and Sandra met in grocery stores and on buses. Then the word had spread and people started calling. Their lawyer, Ron Stone, sat next to Sandra, whose blonde hair was pulled severely back, her face serious and pale. Caroline took the remaining seat beside her. "You look tired," she whispered. Sandra nodded. "Tim has the flu. Of all days, my mother had to come from McKeesport to watch him." Before Caroline could answer, the door swung open again. Men from the Board of Education began to file in, relaxed, joking with one another, shaking hands. When everyone was settled and the meeting had been called to order, Ron Stone stood and cleared his throat. "All children deserve an education," he began, his words familiar. The evidence he presented was clear, specific, steady growth, tasks accomplished. Still, Caroline watched the faces in front of her turn impassive and masked. She thought of Phoebe sitting at the table last night, a pencil gripped in one hand, writing the letters of her name backwards all over the page, wavering but written. The men on the board shuffled papers and cleared their throats. When Ron Stone paused, a young man with dark wavy hair spoke up. "Your passion is admirable, Mr. Stone. We on the board appreciate everything you say, and we appreciate the commitment and devotion of these parents. But these children are mentally retarded. That's the bottom line. Their accomplishments, significant though they may be, have taken place with a protected environment, with teachers capable of giving extra, perhaps undivided attention. That seems a very significant point." Caroline met Sandra's eyes. These words were familiar too. "Mentally retarded is a pejorative term," Ron Stone replied evenly. "These children are delayed, yes, no one's questioning that, but they are not stupid. No one in this room knows what they can achieve. The best hope for their growth and development, as for all children, is an educational environment without predetermined limits. We only ask for equity today." "Ah, equity. Yes, but we haven't got the resources," said another man, thin, with sparse graying hair. "To be equitable, we would have to accept them all. A flood of retarded individuals that would overwhelm the system. Take a look." He passed around copies of a report and began doing a cost-benefit analysis. Caroline took a deep breath. It would do no good for her to lose her temper. A fly buzzed, caught between the panes of glass in the old windows. Caroline thought again of Phoebe, such a loving, quicksilver child, a finder of lost things, a girl who could count to 50 and dress herself and recite the alphabet, a girl who might struggle to speak but who could read Caroline's mood in an instant. Limited? The voices said, flooding the schools? A drag on resources and on the brighter children? Caroline felt a rush of despair. They'd never really see Phoebe, these men. They would never see her as more than different. Slow to speak and to master new things, how could she show them her beautiful daughter, Phoebe, sitting on the rug in the living room and making a tower of blocks, her soft hair falling around her ears, and an expression of absolute concentration on her face. Phoebe putting a 45 on the little record player Caroline had bought her, enthralled by the music, dancing across the smooth oak floors, or Phoebe's soft, small hand suddenly on her knee, at a moment when Caroline was pensive or distracted, absorbed by the world and its concerns. "You okay, Mom?" she would say, or simply, "I love you." Phoebe riding on Al's shoulders in the evening light, Phoebe hugging everyone she met. Phoebe having tantrums and stubbornly defiant. Phoebe dressing herself that morning, so proud. The talk around the table had turned to numbers and logistics, the impossibility of change. Caroline stood up, trembling. Her dead mother's hand flew to her mouth in shock. Caroline herself could not quite believe it, how her life had changed her, what she had become, but there was no going back. A flood of the mentally retarded indeed. She pressed her hands to the table and waited. One by one the men stopped speaking and the room grew quiet. "It's not about numbers," Caroline said. "It's about our children. I have a daughter who is 6 years old. It takes her more time, it's true, to master new things, but she has learned to do everything that any other child learns to do. To crawl and walk and talk and use the bathroom. To dress herself, which she did this morning. What I see is a little girl who wants to learn, and who loves everyone she sees. And I see a room full of men who appear to have forgotten that in this country we promise an education to every child, regardless of ability." For a moment no one spoke. The tall window rattled slightly in the breeze, and paint was beginning to bubble and peel on the beige walls. The voice of the dark-haired man was gentle. We all have, great sympathy for your situation, but how likely is it that your daughter or any of these children will master any academic skills? And what would that do to her self-esteem? If it were me, I'd rather have her settled in a productive and useful trade." "She's 6 years old," Caroline said. "She's not ready to learn a trade." Ron Stone had been watching the exchange intently, and now he spoke. "Actually," he said, "this entire discussion is beside the point." He opened his briefcase and took out a thick cluster of papers. "This is not just a moral or logistical issue, it's the law. This is a petition signed by these parents and by 500 others. It's appended to a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of these families to allow the acceptance of their children into Pittsburgh's public schools. This is the civil rights law." The gray-haired man said, looking up from the document, "You can't use that. That's not the letter or the spirit of this law." "You look these documents over," Ron Stone said, shutting his briefcase. "We'll be in touch." Outside on the old stone steps, they burst into talk. Ron was pleased, cautiously optimistic, but the others were ebullient, hugging Caroline to thank her for her speech. She smiled, hugging them back, feeling both drained and moved by a deep affection for these people. Sandra, of course, who still came over every week for a coffee. Colleen, who, with her daughter, had gathered the names on the petition. Carl, a tall, sprightly man whose only son had died young from heart complications related to Down syndrome, and who had given them office space in his carpet warehouse for their work. She had known none of them 4 years ago except Sandra, yet they were bound to her now by many late nights, many struggles and small triumphs, and so much hope. Agitated still from her speech, she drove back to the preschool. Phoebe jumped up from the circle group and ran to Caroline, hugging her knees. She smelled of milk and chocolate, and there was a streak of dirt across her dress. Her hair was a soft cloud beneath Caroline's hand. Caroline told Doro briefly what had happened. The ugly words flood, drag, still running through her mind. Doro, late for work, touched her arm. We'll talk more tonight. The drive home was beautiful, leaves on the trees and lilacs blooming like drifts of foam and fire against the hills. It had rained the night before and the sky was a clear, bright blue. Caroline parked in the alley, disappointed to see that Al hadn't arrived yet. Together, she and Phoebe walked beneath the flickering shade of the sycamores, through the piercing hum of bees. Caroline sat on the porch steps and turned on the radio. Phoebe started spinning on the soft grass, her arms held out and her head flung back, face to the sun. Caroline watched her, still trying to shed the tension and acrimony of the morning. There was reason to hope, but after all these years of struggling to change the world's perceptions, Caroline made herself stay cautious. Phoebe ran over and cupped her hands around Caroline's ears, whispering a secret. Caroline couldn't catch the words, just the breathless, excited rush of air, and then Phoebe ran off into the sunshine again, twirling in her pale pink dress. The sunlight touched amber glints in her dark hair, and Caroline remembered Nora Henry. Beneath the bright clinic lights, for an instant she was stung with weariness and doubt. Phoebe stopped in her twirling, arms held out to keep her balance. Then she gave a shout and ran headlong across the lawn and up the steps to where Al stood, looking down, a brightly wrapped package in one hand for Phoebe and a bunch of lilacs that Caroline knew were for her. Her heart lifted. He had courted her with a slow, persistent patience, showing up solid and steady week after week, offering a fistful of flowers or some other cheerful gift, the pleasure on his face so real that she could not bear to turn him away. Yet she had held herself back from him, not trusting this love that had come so unexpectedly, from such an unexpected source. Now she stood feeling a rush of pleasure. How afraid she'd been that this time he would stay away. "Pretty day," he said, squatting to hug Phoebe, who flung her arms around his neck in welcome. The package contained a filmy butterfly net with a carved wooden handle, which she took at once, running off toward a bank of dark blue hydrangeas. How did the meeting go? She told him the story, and he listened, shaking his head. "Well, school's not for everyone," he said. "I sure didn't like it much, but Phoebe's a sweet kid, and they shouldn't keep her out." "I want her to have a place in this world," Caroline said, realizing suddenly that it wasn't Al's love for her that she doubted. It was his love for Phoebe. "Honey, she has a place. It's right here. But yeah, I think you're right. I think you're doing the right thing to fight so hard for her." "I hope you had a better week," she said, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. "Oh, same old," he said, sitting on the steps beside her and picking up a stick, which he started to peel. Distantly, mowers hummed. Phoebe's little radio played, "Love, love me do." "I logged 2,398 miles this week, a record even for me." He'll ask again, Caroline thought. This was the moment he was road-weary and ready to settle down, and he'd ask. She watched his hands move deftly, swiftly stripping the bark, and her heart surged. This time she'd say yes. But Al didn't speak. The silence extended for so long that finally she felt pressure to break it. "That was a nice gift," she said, nodding across the grassy space where Phoebe was running, the net making bright arcs in the air. "Fellow in Georgia made it," Al said. "Nicest guy, had a whole bunch of them he'd carved for his grandkids. We got to talking in the grocery store. He collects shortwave radios and invited me to stop by and see them. Spent the whole night talking, me and him. Now that's the plus of the wandering life. Oh yeah," he went on, reaching into his pants pocket and pulling out a white envelope. "Here's your mail from Atlanta." Caroline took the envelope without comment. Inside there would be several $20 bills folded neatly into a plain white paper. Al brought them back from Cleveland, Memphis, Atlanta, Akron, cities he frequented on his runs. She had told him simply that this money was for Phoebe from her father. Al accepted this without comment, but Caroline's feelings were more complex. Sometimes she dreamed she was walking through Nora Henry's house, taking things from the shelves and the cupboards, filling a cloth bag, happy until she came upon Nora Henry, standing by a window, her expression distant and infinitely sad. She'd wake, trembling, and get up and make herself some tea, sitting in the darkness. When the money came, she put it in the bank and didn't think about it until the next envelope arrived. She had done this for 5 years now, and she had saved almost $7,000. Phoebe was still running, chasing after butterflies, birds, motes of light, the fluttering notes spilling from the radio. Al was fiddling with the dial. The nice thing about this city is that you can really find some music. Some of those podunk little towns I stay in, all you get is the top 40. Gets old after a while. He began to hum along with Begin the Beguiling. My parents used to dance to this song, Caroline said, and for an instant she was sitting on the chairs of her childhood home, invisible, watching her mother in a full-skirted dress welcoming guests at the door. I haven't thought of it in years, but every now and then they used to roll the rug up in the living room on a Saturday night and have some other couples in, and they'd dance. We ought to go dancing sometime, Al said. You like to dance, Caroline? Caroline felt something shift in her then, some excitement. She couldn't place it, something to do with her anger from the morning passing, and the vibrant day, and the warmth of Al's arms next to her. The breeze fluttered the poplars, revealing the silvery undersides of their leaves. Why wait? She asked, and stood, extending her hand. He was puzzled, bemused, and then he was standing with his hand resting on her shoulder, and they were moving on the lawn to the thin strains of the music. The background of rushing cars, sunlight mingled in her hair. The grass was soft beneath her stocking feet, and they moved together so easily, dipping and turning, the tension she had carried with her from the meeting dissipating with each step. Al smiled, pressing her close. Sunlight struck her neck. Oh, she thought, and he spun her again. I'll say yes. There was the pleasure of the sunlight and Phoebe's floating laughter, and Al's hands warmed through the fabric on her back. They moved in the grass, turning with the music, connected by it. The traffic rushing by was as present and soothing as the ocean. Other sounds, thin, lifted through the strands of music, through the bright day. Caroline didn't register them at first, then Al turned her, and she stopped dancing. Phoebe was kneeling in the soft warm grass by the hydrangeas, crying too hard to speak, holding up her hand. Caroline ran and knelt in the grass, studying the angry swollen circles on Phoebe's palm. It's a bee sting, she said. Oh, honey, it hurts, doesn't it? She pressed her face into Phoebe's warm hair, soft skin, and her chest rising and falling beneath that, the steady pattern of her heart. Here was the thing that couldn't be measured, couldn't be quantified or even explained. Phoebe was herself alone. You could not finally categorize a human being. You could not presume to know what life was or what it might hold. Oh, sweetie, it's all right, she said, smoothing Phoebe's hair. But Phoebe's sobs were giving way to a wheezing like the croup she suffered as a child. Her palm was swelling, the back of her hands and her fingers, too. Caroline felt herself grow still inside, even as she swiftly rose and called to Al. Hurry! She cried, her voice so loud and strange. Oh, Al, she's allergic. She was lifting Phoebe, heavy in her arms, and then she paused, bewildered, because her keys were in her purse on the kitchen counter, and she couldn't figure out how to open the door while holding Phoebe, who was wheezing harder now. Then Al, who was there, taking Phoebe and running to the car, and Caroline had the keys somehow, the keys and her purse. She drove as fast as she dared through the city streets. By the time they reached the hospital, Phoebe's breath was coming in short, desperate gasps. They left the car at the entrance, and Caroline grabbed the first nurse she saw. It's an allergic reaction. We need to see a doctor now. The nurse was older, a bit heavy-set, and her gray hair turned under in a page boy. She led them through a set of sealed doors where Al put Phoebe gently on the gurney. Phoebe was struggling to breathe now, her lips faintly blue. Caroline, too, was having trouble breathing. Fear pulled so tightly in her chest. The nurse swept Phoebe's hair back, touching her fingers to the pulse in her neck. And then Caroline watched her see Phoebe as Dr. Henry had seen her on the snowy night so long ago. She saw the nurse taking in the beautifully sloped eyes, the small hands that had gripped the net so hard as she ran after butterflies. She saw her her eyes narrow slightly. Still, she was not prepared. Are you sure? The nurse asked, looking up and meeting her eyes. Are you really sure you want me to call a doctor? Caroline stood fixed in place. She remembered the scents of boiled vegetables and the day she had driven away with Phoebe. and the impassive expressions worn by the men on the Board of Education. In a rush of wild alchemy, her fear transformed itself into anger, fierce and piercing. She raised her hand to slap the bland, impassive face of the nurse, but Al caught her wrist. "Call the doctor," he said to the nurse. "Do it now." He put his arm around Caroline and did not let go. Not when the nurse turned away or when the doctor appeared. Not until Phoebe's breathing began to ease and some of the color returned to her cheeks. Then they went together to the waiting room and sat in the orange plastic chairs, hand in hand, nurses buzzing and voices coming over the intercom and babies crying. "She could have died," Caroline said. Her calm broke. She began to tremble. "But she didn't," Al said firmly. Al's hand was large, warm, comforting. He'd been so patient all these years. He had come back again and again, saying he knew a good thing when he saw it, saying he'd wait. But he'd been away 2 weeks this time, not one. He hadn't called from the road, and he thought he'd brought her flowers as always. He hadn't proposed for 6 months. He could drive away in his truck and never come back, never give her another chance to say yes. She raised his hand and kissed his palm. Strong, so rough with calluses, so marked with lines. He turned, startled from his thoughts, as puzzled as if he was just been stung himself. "Caroline," his tone was formal, "there's something I want to say." "I know." She placed his hand on her heart and held it there. "Al, I've been such a fool. Of course I'll marry you," she said. Do you think he was going to ask? Or do you think he was going to say, "I'm out of here"? Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Friends, I'm really sorry for that outburst. Were you thinking the same thing, though? Like, we just don't know, except now we're 7 years forward. We're in 1977. Oh goodness, July 1977. "Like this?" Nora asked. She was lying on the beach, and beneath her hip the gritty sand slid and shifted. Every time she took a deep breath and released it, sand slithered out from under her. The sun was so hot, like a shimmering metal plate against her skin. She had been here for over an hour, posing and reposing, the word repose, like a taunt, for it was what she longed to do and could not. It was her vacation, after all, and she had won 2 weeks at Aruba for selling the highest number of cruise packages in the state of Kentucky last year. And yet here she was, sand sticking to her sweat on her arms and neck as she lay still, pressed between sun and beach. To distract herself, she kept her gaze on Paul, who was running along the shore, speck on the horizon. He was 13 and had shot up like a sapling in this last year. Tall and awkward, he ran every morning as if he might escape from his own life. Waves crashed slowly against the beach. The tide was turning, coming in, and the harsh noon light would soon change, making the picture David wanted impossible until tomorrow. A strand of hair was stuck against Nora's lip, tickling, but she willed herself to stillness. "Good," David said, bent over his camera and clicking off a rapid series of shots. "Oh yeah, great, that's really very good." "I'm hot," she said. "Just a few more minutes, we're almost done." He was on his knees now, his thighs winter pale against the sand. He worked so hard and spent long hours in his darkroom, too, clipping images to dry on the clotheslines he'd strung from wall to wall. "Think about the seed, waves in the water, waves in the sand. You're part of that, Nora. You'll see in the photo, I'll show you." She lay still beneath the sun, watching him work, remembering days early in their marriage when they'd gone out for long walks in the spring evenings, holding hands, the air infused with scents of honeysuckle and hyacinths. What had she imagined, that younger version of herself, walking in the soft still light of dusk, dreaming her dreams? Not this life, certainly. Nora had learned the travel business inside out over the past 5 years. She had organized the office, and gradually she had started overseeing trips. She built a stable client list and learned to sell, pushing glossy brochures across her desk, describing in breathless detail places she herself had only dreamed of going. She'd become an expert at solving last-minute crises, lost luggage, misplaced passports, sudden bouts of giardiitis, breath last year when Pete Warren decided to retire, she'd taken a deep breath and bought the business. Now it was all hers. From the low brick buildings to the boxes of blank airline tickets in the closet, her days were hectic, busy, satisfying, and every night she came home to a house full of silence. "I still don't see it," she said when David finally finished. When she was standing up and brushing sand from her legs and her arms, shaking sand from her hair. "Why take the photo of me at all if you're hoping I'll just disappear into the landscape?" "It's about perspective," David said, looking up from his equipment. His hair was wild, his cheeks and forearms flushed with noon sun. In the far distance, Paul had turned and was on his way back, drawing nearer. "It's about expectations. People will look at this picture and see a beach, rolling dunes, and then they'll glimpse something a little odd, something familiar in your particular set of curves, or they'll read the title and look again, searching for the woman they didn't see the first time, and they'll find you." There was intensity in his voice. The wind coming off the ocean moved through his dark hair. It made her sad because he spoke of photography as if he had spoken once of medicine, of their marriage. A language and tone that evoked the lost past and filled her with longing. "Do you and David talk about big things or small things?" Bree asked her once. And Nora was shocked to realize how many of their conversations were about things as perfunctory and necessary as household chores and Paul's schedule. The sun was bright on her hair, and the gritty sand had caught in the tender skin between her legs. David was absorbed in putting away his camera. Nora had hoped this dream vacation would be a path back to the closeness they'd once shared. This was what had compelled her to spend so many hours lying in the hot sun, holding herself still while David took roll after roll of photos. But they had been here 3 days now, and nothing but the setting was significantly different from home. Each day they drank their morning coffee in silence. David found ways to work. He was either taking pictures or fishing. He did read in the evening, swinging in the hammock. Nora took walks and naps, puttered, and went shopping at the bright, overpriced tourist shops in town. Paul played his guitar and he ran. Nora shaded her eyes and looked down the golden curve of the beach. Closer now, the runner's shape had emerged, and she saw it was not Paul after all. The man running was tall, lean, maybe 35 or 40. He wore blue nylon-edged shorts with white piping and no shirt. His shoulders, already tanned, were edged with a burn that looked painful. As he drew close to them, he slowed and then stopped, hands on his hips, breathing heavily. "Nice camera," he said, looking straight at Nora. He added, "Interesting shot." He was beginning to go bald. His eyes were dark brown, intense. She turned away, feeling their heat, as David began to talk. Waves and dunes, sand and flesh, 2 conflicting images at once. She gazed down the beach. Yes, there, barely visible, was another running figure, her son. The sun was so bright, for a few seconds she felt dizzy, little silver fish of light flashing behind her eyelids, just as it glanced across the edges of the waves. Howard. She wondered where he was from, where he'd gotten a name like that. He and David were talking intently now about apertures and filters. "So you're the inspiration for this study," he said, turning to include Nora. "I suppose," she said, brushing sand off her wrist. "It's a bit hard on the skin," she added, aware suddenly that the new bathing suit left her nearly naked. The wind moved over her, moved through her hair. "No, you have beautiful skin," Howard said. David's eyes widened. He looked at her as if he had never seen her before, and Nora felt a surge of triumph. "See," she wanted to say, "I have beautiful skin." But the intenseness of Howard's gaze stopped her. "You should see David's other work," Nora said, and she gestured to the cottage, tucked low beneath the palms, bougainvillea, cascading off the porch trellises. He brought his portfolio, a wall, her words, also an invitation. "I'd like that," Howard said, turning back to David. "I'm interested in your study." "Why not?" David said. "Join us for lunch." But Howard had a meeting in town at 1 o'clock. "Here comes Paul," Nora said. He was running very fast along the edge of the water, pushing through the last 100 yards, his arms and legs flashing in the light, the wavering heat. My son, Nora thought, the world opening for an instant as it sometimes did around the very fact of his presence. Our son, she said to Howard. He's a runner too. He has good form, Howard observed. Paul drew close and began to slow down. And once he reached them, he bent down with his hands on his knees, dragging deep breaths into his lungs. And good time, David said, glancing at his watch. Don't do it, Nora thought. David couldn't seem to see how much Paul recoiled at David's suggestions for his future. Don't. But David pushed on. I hate to see him miss his vocation. Look at that height. Think what he could do on a court, but he doesn't give a damn about basketball. Paul looked up, grimacing, and Nora felt a flare of familiar irritation. Why couldn't David understand that the more he pushed basketball, the more Paul would resist? If he wanted Paul to play, he ought to forbid it instead. I like running, Paul said, standing up. Who can blame you, Howard said, reaching to shake hands, when you run like that? Paul shook his hand, flushing with pleasure. You have beautiful skin, he said to her moments ago. Nora wondered if her own face had been so transparent. Come to dinner, she suggested impulsively, inspired by Howard's kindness to Paul. She was hungry, thirsty too, and the sun had made her lightheaded. Since you can't come for lunch, come for dinner. Bring your wife, of course, she added. Bring your family. We'll build a fire and cook out on the beach. Howard frowned, looking over the shining water. He clasped his hands and put them behind his head, stretching. Unfortunately, he said, I'm here alone. A retreat of sorts. I'm about to be divorced. I'm sorry, Nora said, though she was not. Come anyway, David said. Nora throws wonderful dinner parties. I'll show you the rest of the series I'm working on. It's all about perception. Transformation. Ah, transformation, Howard said. I'm all for that. I'd love to come to dinner. David and Howard talked for a few minutes while Paul paced along the waves, cooling down, and then Howard left. A few minutes later, standing in the kitchen slicing cucumbers for lunch, Nora watched him walk far down the beach, there and gone, and there again as the curtain caught the breeze. She remembered the dark burn on his shoulders, his penetrating eyes and voice. Water rushed in the pipes as Paul showered, and there was the soft rustling of paper as David arranged his photos in the living room. He'd seemed obsessed over the years, always seeing the world, seeing her, as if from behind the lens of a camera. Their lost daughter still hovered between them. Their lives had shaped themselves around her absence. Nora even wondered at times if that loss was the main thing holding them together. She slid the cucumbers into a salad bowl and started peeling a carrot. Howard was a pinprick in the distance, then gone. His hands were large. She remembered the palms and cuticles pale against his tan. Beautiful skin, he had said, and his eyes hadn't left hers. After lunch, David dozed in the hammock and Nora lay down on the bed beneath the window. An ocean breeze flowed in. She felt abundantly alive, somehow connected to the sand and the sea by the wind. Howard was just an ordinary person, almost scrawny, and beginning to go bald, yet he was mysteriously compelling, too, conjured perhaps from her own deep loneliness and wishing. She imagined Bree, delighted with her, laughing. Well, why not? She would say, really, Nora, why not? I'm a married woman, Nora replied, shifting to look out the window at the dazzling shifting sand, eager for her sister to refute her. Nora, for heaven's sweet sake, you only live once. Why not have some fun? Nora stood walking softly on the old wood-worn boards and fixed herself a gin and tonic with lime. She sat on the porch swing, lazy in the breeze, watching David dozing, so unknown to her these days. Notes from Paul's guitar floating through the soft air. She imagined him sitting cross-legged on the narrow bed, head bent in concentration over the new Almasa guitar that he loved, a gift from David on his last birthday. It was a beautiful instrument with an ebony fretboard and rosewood back and sides, brass turners. David tried with Paul. He pushed too hard on sports, it was true, but he also made time to take Paul fishing or hiking in the woods on their endless search for rocks. He'd spent hours researching this guitar, ordering it from a company in New York. His face full of quiet pleasure as Paul lifted it reverently from the box. She looked at David now, sleeping on the other side of the porch, a muscle working in his cheek. David, she whispered, but he did not hear her. David, she said a bit louder, but he did not stir. At 4:00, she roused herself dreamily. She chose the sundress splashed with flowers, gathered at the waist, thin straps over her shoulders. She put on an apron and began to cook. Simple but luxurious food. oyster stew with crisp crackers on the side, corn yellowing on the cob, a fresh green salad, small lobsters she bought that morning at the market, still in buckets of seawater. As she moved in the tiny kitchen, improvising roasting pans from cake pans and substituting oregano for marjoram in the salad dressing, the crisp cotton skirt moved lightly against her thighs, her hips. The air, warm as breath, glanced across her arms, and she plunged her hands into a sink of cold water, rinsing the lettuce leaf by delicate leaf. Outside, Paul and David worked to light a fire in the half-rusted grill, its holes patched with aluminum foil. There were paper plates on the weathered table and wine poured into red plastic glasses. They would eat the lobster with their fingers, butter running down their palms. She heard his voice before she saw him, another tone, slightly lower than David's, and slightly more nasal, with a neutral northern accent. Crisp air, edged with snow, floated into the room with every syllable. Nora dried her hands on the kitchen towel and went to the doorway. The three men, it shocked her that she thought of Paul this way, but he stood shoulder to shoulder with David now, nearly grown and independent, as if his body had never had anything to do with hers at all. They were clustered on the sand just beyond the porch. The grill gave off its aroma of smoke and resin, and the coals sent a wavering heat into the sky. Paul, shirtless, stood with his hands thrust into his pockets of his cutoffs, answering with awkward brevity the questions that came his way. They did not see her husband, and her son. Their eyes were on the fire and on the ocean, smooth as opaque glass at this hour. It was Howard, facing them, who lifted his chin to her and smiled. For an instant, before the others turned, before Howard raised the bottle of wine and slid it into her hands, their eyes met. It was a moment real to only the two of them, something that could not be proven later. An instant of communion subject to whatever the future would impose. But it was real. The darkness of his eyes, his face and hers opening in pleasure and promise, the world crashing around them like the surf. David turned, smiling, and the moment slammed shut like a door. "It's white," Howard said, handing her the bottle. Nora was struck by how ordinary Howard seemed then, by the silly way his sideburns grew halfway down his cheeks, the hidden meaning of this earlier moment. Had she imagined it then? It was gone. "I hope that's all right." "Perfect," she said. "We're having lobster." Yes, so ordinary this talk. The stunning moment was behind them now, and she was the gracious hostess, moving as easily in her role as she moved within her whisper of address. Howard was her guest. She offered him a wicker chair and a drink, and when she came back carrying bottles of gin and tonic and a bucket of ice on a tray, the sun had reached the edge of the water. Clouds billowed high in airy shades of pink and peach. They ate on the porch. Darkness fell swiftly, and David lit the candles set at intervals along the railing. Beyond the tide came in, waves rushing invisibly against the sand. In the flickering light, Howard's voice rose and fell and rose again. He talked about a camera obscura he had built. The camera obscura was a mahogany box that sealed out all light except for a single pinpoint. This pinprick cast a tiny image of the world onto a mirror. The instrument was the precursor to the camera. Some painters, Vermeer was one, had used it as a tool to achieve an extraordinary level of detail in their work. Howard was exploring this, too. Nora listened, awash in the night, struck by his imagery. The world projected on a darkened interior wall, tiny figures caught in light but moving. It was so different from her sessions with David, when the camera seemed to pin her in place and time, hold her still. That, she realized, sipping her wine in the darkness, was the problem at the heart of everything. Somewhere along the way, she and David had gotten stuck. They circled each other now, fixed in their separate orbits. The conversation shifted, and Howard told stories about the time he'd spent in Vietnam, working as a photographer for the Army, documenting battles. A lot of it was boring, actually, he said when Paul expressed his admiration. A lot of it was just riding up and down the Mekong on a boat. It's an extraordinary river, though, an extraordinary place. After dinner, Paul went to his room, and a few minutes later notes from his guitar cascaded amid the sounds of the waves. He had not wanted to come on this vacation. He'd given up a week at music camp, and he had an important concert to play just a few days after they got home. David had insisted that he come. He did not take Paul's musical ambitions seriously. As an avocation, it was fine, but not as a career. But Paul was passionate about the guitar, determined to go to Juilliard. David, who had worked so hard to give them every comfort, got tense every time the subject came up. Now, Paul's notes fell through the air, winged and graceful, but each one a little cut, too, the point of a knife piercing flesh. The conversation moved from optics to the rarefied light of the Hudson River Valley, where Howard lived, and southern France, where he liked to visit. He described the narrow road, a thin dust rising in the fields of pulsing sunflowers. He was all voice, hardly more than a shadow next to her, but his words moved through her like Paul's music did, somehow both inside and outside her at once. David poured more wine and changed the subject, and then they were stepping into the brightly lit living room. David pulled a series of black and white photos from his portfolio, and he and Howard launched into an intense discussion about the qualities of light. Nora lingered. The photographs they were discussing were all of her. Her hips, her skin, her hands, her hair, and yet she was excluded from the conversation. Object, not subject. Now and then she went into an office in Lexington. Nora would find a photo, anonymously yet eerily familiar too, some curve of her body, or a place she had visited with David, stripped of its original meaning and transformed. An image of her own flesh that had become abstract, an idea. She had tried, by posing for David, to ease some of the distance that had grown between them. His fault, hers. It really didn't matter. But watching David now, absorbed in his explanation, she understood that he did not really see her, and hadn't for years. Anger rose up in a rush that left her trembling. She turned and walked from the room. Since the day with the wasps, she had drunk very little, but now she went into the kitchen and poured herself a red plastic glass brimming with wine. All around her were dirty pots and congealing butter, the fiery red husks of lobster like the shells of dead cicadas. Such a lot of work for such brief pleasure. Usually David did the dishes, but tonight Nora tied an apron around her waist and filled the sink and put the remaining oyster stew away in the refrigerator. In the living room the voices went on, rising and falling like the sea. What had she been thinking, putting on this dress, falling into Howard's voice? She was Nora Henry, the wife of David, the mother of Paul, a son nearly grown. There were strands of gray in her hair, which she did not believe anyone could see except herself. Squinting in the harsh light of the bathroom, still it was true. Howard had come to discuss photography with David, and that was that. She stepped outside, carrying the garbage to the dumpster. The sand was faintly cold against her bare feet, and the air as warm as her own skin. Nora walked to the edge of the ocean and stood gazing at the vivid white sweep of stars. Behind her, the screen door opened and swung shut. David and Howard came out, walking through the sand and darkness. "Thanks for cleaning up," David said. His hand touched her hand briefly. He touched his hand briefly to her back, and she tensed, making an effort not to move away. "Sorry not to help. I guess we got talking. Howard has some good ideas." "Actually, I was mesmerized by your arms," Howard noted, referring to the hundreds of shots David had taken. He picked up a piece of driftwood and flung it hard. They heard it splash and the waves licking, pulling it out to sea. Behind them, the house was like a lantern, casting a bright circle, but the three of them stood in the darkness so complete that Nora could barely see David's face, or Howard's, or her own hands. Only shadowy shapes and disembodied voices in the night. The conversation meandered, circling back to technique and process. Nora thought she might scream. She put one bare foot behind the other, meaning to turn and leave, when suddenly a hand brushed her thigh. She paused, startled, waiting. In a moment, Howard's fingers ran lightly up the seam of her dress, and then his hand was slipping inside her pocket. A sudden, secret warmth against her flesh. Nora held her breath. David talked on about his pictures. She was still wearing the apron, and it was very dark, and after a moment she made a slight turn, and Howard's hand flowered open against the thin cotton, the flatness of her stomach. "Well, that's true," Howard said, his voice low and easy. "You'd sacrifice something in clarity if you were used to that filter, but the effect would certainly be worth it." Nora let her breath out slowly, wondering if Howard could feel the wild, rapid pulsing of her blood. Warmth radiated from his fingers. She was filled with such yearning that she ached. The waves rose and eased again and rose again. Nora stood very still, listening to the rush of her own breath. "Now, with the camera obscura, you're one step closer to the process," Howard said. "It's really quite remarkable the way it frames the world. I wish you'd come by and see it. Will you?" he asked. "I'm taking Paul deep-sea fishing tomorrow," David said. "Maybe the next day." "I think I'll go inside," Nora said faintly. "Nora gets bored," David said. "Who can blame her?" Howard said, and his hand pressed low on her belly, hard and swift like the beat of a wing. Then he slid it from her pocket. "Come tomorrow morning if you want," he said. "I'm making some drawings with the camera obscura." Nora nodded without speaking, imagining the single shaft of light piercing through darkness, casting marvelous images on the wall. He left a few minutes later, disappearing almost at once into the darkness. "I like that guy," David said later when they were inside. The kitchen was immaculate now, all evidence of her dreamy afternoon hidden away. Nora was standing at the window looking out at the dark beach, listening to the waves. Both hands sunk deeply in the pockets of her dress. "Yeah," she agreed, "I do too." Oh, no. Oh. The next morning, David and Paul rose before sunrise to drive up the coast and catch the fishing boat. Nora lay there in the dark while they got ready, the clean cotton sheets soft against her skin, listening to them bump around awkwardly in the living room, trying not to make any noise. Footsteps then, and the roar of the car starting, then fading into silence, the sound of waves. She lay there, languid, as a line of light formed where sky and ocean met. Then she showered and got dressed and made herself a cup of coffee. She ate half a grapefruit, washed her dishes and put them neatly away, and walked out the door. She was wearing shorts and a turquoise blouse patterned with flamingos. Her white sneakers were tied together and swinging from her hand. She'd washed her hair, and the ocean wind was blowing it dry, tangling it around her face. Howard's cottage, a mile down the beach, was nearly identical to her own. He was sitting on the porch, bent over a darkly finished wooden box. He was wearing white shorts and an orange plaid madras shirt unbuttoned. His feet, like hers, were bare. He stood up as she drew near. "Want some coffee?" he called. "I've been watching you walk down the beach." "No, thanks," she said. "You sure? It's Irish coffee, with a little jolt, if you know what I mean." "Maybe in a minute." She climbed the steps and ran her hand over the polished mahogany box. "Is this the camera obscura?" "It is," he said. "Come take a look." She sat down on the chair, still warm from his flesh, and looked through the aperture. The world was there, the long stretch of beach and the cluster of rocks and a sail moving slowly in the horizon. Wind lifted in the piney casuarina trees. Everything tiny and rendered in such sharp detail, framed and contained, yet alive, not static. Nora looked up then, blinking, and found that the world had been transformed as well. The flowers so sharply drawn against the sand, the chair with its bright stripes, and the couple walking at the edge of the water. Vivid, startling, so much more than she'd realized. "Oh," she said, looking back into the box, "it's astonishing. The world is so precise, so rich, I can even see the wind moving in the trees." Howard laughed. "It's wonderful, isn't it? I knew you'd like it." She thought of Paul as an infant, his mouth rounded in a perfect O, as he lay in the crib staring up at some ordinary amazement. She bent her head again to view the world contained, and then looked up to see it transformed. Realized from its surrounding frame of darkness, even the light was shimmering, alive. "It's so beautiful," she whispered. "I almost can't stand how beautiful it is." "I know," Howard said. "Go. Be in it. Let me draw you." She rose and walked out into the hot sand, the glare. She turned and stood before Howard, his head bent over the aperture, watching his hand move across the sketch pad. Her hair kindled already. The sun was a hot, flat hand. And she remembered posing the day before and the day before that, and how many times she had just stood this way. The subject, and an object too, posed to evoke or to preserve what really did not exist. Her true thoughts locked away. She stood now, a woman reduced to a perfect miniature of herself, every fact of her cast by light onto a mirror. The ocean wind, warm and damp, moved in his hair, and Howard's hands with their long fingers and trim nails moved quickly as he sketched her, fixing her image on the page. She remembered the sand shifting beneath her hips as she posed for David's camera, and how they had talked about her later. David and Howard, not as a flesh and blood woman in the room, but rather as an image, form. Remembering this, her body seemed fragile suddenly, as if she were not the accomplished, self-sufficient woman who had taken a group to China and back, but rather someone who might be swept away by the next gust of wind. Then she remembered Howard's hand warming her pocket and her flesh. That hand, the one moving now, the one that drew her. She reached down to her waist and caught the hem of her blouse. Slowly, without hesitation, she pulled it over her head and let it fall on the sand. On the porch, Howard stopped drawing, though he did not lift his head. The small muscles in his arms and shoulders had ceased moving. Nora unzipped her shorts. They slid down over her hips, and she stepped out of them. So far, it was nothing unfamiliar, just the same swimsuit she had modeled in so many times before. But now she reached behind and unhooked the straps of her top. She pushed the bottoms over her hips and down her legs, kicking them away. She stood feeling the sun and wind move across her skin. Howard slowly raised his head from the camera obscura and sat staring. For an instant, it had a nightmare quality, the sense of panic and shame when she realized in the middle of a dream, shopping or walking in a crowded park, that she had forgotten to get dressed. She started to reach for her suit. "No, don't," Howard whispered, and she paused, straightening. "You are so beautiful." He rose, then carefully, slowly, as if she were a bird he might startle in flight. But Nora stood very still, intently present in her body, feeling as if she were made out of sand. Sand meeting fire, and about to be transformed, smoothed, made glittering. Howard crossed the few feet of beach. It seemed to take him forever, his feet sinking into the warm sand, and when he finally reached her, he stopped, without touching her, and he stared. The wind moved in her hair, and he pushed a strand from her lip, tucking it very gently behind her ear. "I could never capture this," he said. "What you are in this moment, I could never capture it." Nora smiled and splayed her hand flat on his chest, feeling the thin madras cotton and the warm flesh, the layers of muscle, bone, the sternum she remembered from the days when she had studied medical bones in order to better understand David and his work, the manubrium and the gladiolus, shaped like a sword, the true ribs and the faults, the lines of union. He cupped his hands gently around her face, and she let her own hand fall. Together, without speaking, they walked to the little cottage. She left her clothes on the sand. She did not care about that either, that anyone might see them. The boards of the porch gave slightly beneath her feet, and the cloth over the camera obscura was thrown back, and she saw with satisfaction that Howard had sketched the beach and horizon, the scattered rocks and trees. All these were with perfect reproductions. He had sketched her hair, a soft cloud, amorphous, but that was all. Where she had stood, the page was blank. Her clothes had fallen like leaves, and he had looked up to see her standing there, and for once it was she who stopped time. The room seemed dim after the light of the beach, and the world was framed in the window as if it had been in the lens of the camera obscura, so bright and vivid that it brought tears to her eyes. She sat on the edge of the bed. "Lie down," he said, pulling his shirt over his head. "I just want to look at you for a moment." She did, and he stood over her, his eyes moving across her skin. "Stay with me," he said, and he shocked her by kneeling and resting his head on her belly, his unshaven cheek bristling against the flatness of her stomach. She felt his weight with every breath she took, and his own breath traveled on her skin. She reached down, weaving her hands through his thinning hair, and pulled him up to kiss her. Later, she would be astonished that she had done these things. Not that she had done these things, or any of those that followed, but that she had done them on Howard's bed beneath the open, unscreened window, framed like an image in a camera. David was gone far out at sea with Paul, fishing. Still, anyone might have walked by and seen them. Yet she did not stop then or later. He was with her like a fever, a compulsion, an open door with her into her own possibilities, into what she believed was freedom. Strangely, she found that her secret made the distance between herself and David seem more bearable, too. She went back to Howard again and again, even after David remarked about how many walks she was taking, how far she went, even when lingering in bed while Howard fixed them both a drink. She fished his shorts off the floor and found a photo of his smiling wife and their 3 small children. Inside a letter that said, "My mother is better. We all miss and love you, and we'll see you next week." This happened in the afternoon. Sunlight glittering on the moving water, heat shimmering up from the sand. The ceiling fan clicked in the dim room. She held the photo, gazed outside into the landscape of the imagination. The brilliant light. In real life, this photo would have cut, swift and sure. But here she felt nothing. Nora slid the photo back and let a short slip back to the floor. Here this did not matter. Only the dream mattered and the fevered light. For the next 10 days, she met him. We will end there. We'll see you next time on the next episode of The Memory Keeper's Daughter.